History paints him as a wartime titan, the man who stood against Hitler and led the Soviet Union to victory. But behind the parades and propaganda, a darker reality festered. What if I told you millions were crushed, starved, and erased not by an enemy, but by Stalin himself? And worse, some of these horrors were never meant to be discovered. This is the part of history they hoped you'd never ask about. Stay with me, because once you hear what really happened, you'll never forget it. If you're stunned already, this is just the beginning. Subscribe, because this is where history's hidden chapters come alive. The Great Purge, killing his own to keep power. He feared betrayal, so he turned on everyone. In the late 1930s, paranoia seeped through the walls of the Kremlin like poison. Stalin, once a revolutionary hero, now feared shadows more than bullets. He didn't trust the party. He didn't trust the military. He didn't even trust the people who helped him rise to power. So he turned suspicion into policy, and policy into slaughter. The Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror, began in 1936. It would consume the Soviet Union for the next 2 years. It started with show trials. Stalin's old comrades, the very men who stood beside him during the revolution, were dragged into courtrooms, accused of outlandish conspiracies, and forced to confess under torture. They wept. They begged. They were shot anyway. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind closed doors, Stalin signed execution lists with a cold flourish. Each day, more names. Each day, more disappearances. The numbers are staggering. Over 1.5 million arrested. More than 700,000 executed. And those who weren't killed? Sent to gulags, frozen prisons in the Siberian wilderness. One general confessed after being tortured for 185 hours. Another refused to confess and was executed on the spot. Stalin even ordered the death of the man who built the Soviet secret police, Genrik Yagoda. He fed the machine until it ate him too. Entire families were wiped out. Children sent to orphanages, renamed, and re-educated to forget their lineage. It was more than a purge, it was an erasure. Survivor account: Anna M., daughter of a Soviet linguist, remembered her father being taken in the middle of the night. He kissed my forehead and said, "If I don't come back, don't ever forget I loved you." He never came back. We never found out what happened. Even Stalin's closest confidants lived in fear. Every knock at the door could be the last. Some committed suicide before being arrested. Others confessed to impossible crimes just to end the torment. Holodomor, the famine he engineered. Imagine starving to death while surrounded by food, because your own government locked it away. In 1932, Stalin had a problem. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, was pushing back against his policies. Farmers resisted collectivization. They hid grain. They refused to surrender their land. So Stalin responded the only way he knew how, with ruthless, calculated punishment. He deployed the Red Army and NKVD secret police to strip the land bare. Grain was confiscated. Livestock slaughtered. Entire villages blacklisted. Food became contraband. Traveling to find food was forbidden. Even picking up spilled grain was a crime. By winter, starvation had set in. But Stalin's orders were clear: no aid. Let them die. And they did. In silence. Testimonies from survivors are gut-wrenching. Ivan Juba, who was 9 years old during the famine, recalled, "My mother boiled grass. When even the grass was gone, we chewed leather. I watched my brother die slowly. He cried for days. Then, nothing." Mothers sat beside the tiny corpses of their children, unable to bury them. Entire towns were silent, not from peace, but from the absence of life. Soviet officials kept count of how many villages were depopulated. One internal report estimated over 30,000 people were dying daily during the height of the famine. It was genocide, with a signature, not a gun. The world didn't know, or pretended not to. Western journalists were escorted through staged villages. One famously wrote, "I saw no starvation in Ukraine." Meanwhile, a few miles away, corpses were stacked like firewood. Cannibal Island, Stalin's most vile experiment. They were told they were going to a settlement. They were dumped on an island, with nothing. In May 1933, Stalin's regime launched an operation that would be remembered only in whispers, if remembered at all. Thousands of people labeled as socially harmful, meaning homeless, out of work, or even politically suspicious, were rounded up and shipped to Siberia. No trials. No process. Just exile. 6,700 were sent to a tiny speck of land, Cannibal Island. There were no shelters. No tools. No food except sacks of flour. And the flour was uncooked, fatal when eaten raw. Within days, dysentery, violence, and death swept through the camp. Eyewitness Andrei V., a guard stationed on the island, wrote, "We saw people eating the dead. Then they began killing the living. One girl was tied to a tree. They cut her while she screamed. They roasted her limbs." He paused his account for days, unable to continue. When he resumed, he wrote, "It stopped being about survival. It became madness." Within 13 weeks, over 4,000 people were dead. The rest were evacuated or unaccounted for. Stalin's government called it a logistical failure. But internal memos reveal chilling language. It had been a test of human resilience or cruelty. Cannibal wasn't an accident. It was an experiment. The Katyn massacre, silencing a nation's mind. What Stalin feared most wasn't an army, it was intellect. Spring, 1940. Deep in the forests of western Russia, silence was broken by the steady crack of gunfire. It echoed off the birch trees. One shot at a time. Thousands of Polish officers, scholars, priests, doctors, the soul of a nation, were being marched into woods and executed. Hands tied. Eyes blindfolded. One bullet to the base of the skull. The massacre spanned multiple locations: Katyn, Kalinin, Kharkiv. But the name Katyn would come to represent all of them. The victims had surrendered peacefully when the Soviets invaded eastern Poland in 1939. They believed they were prisoners of war. But to Stalin, they were something else: potential threats. Future resistance. So he gave the order. One Soviet document, signed by Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, recommended a swift resolution. Stalin's approval was scrawled in red ink beside the name. Over 22,000 lives ended, buried in mass graves. Not soldiers, not criminals, thinkers, writers, organizers, the people who help a nation remember who it is. Janina Lewandowska was the only woman among the dead. A pilot, a symbol of Poland's emerging future. She was executed and dumped into the same pit as her male counterparts. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility. They blamed the Nazis. And for a time, the lie worked. The truth was too inconvenient, too disruptive during the war. Even the Western allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, tiptoed around the evidence. But the families knew. One survivor, Jerzy Kaczynski, recalled, "My father was taken. My uncles. My teachers. All of them. We were told they'd been transferred. 4 years we waited." It wasn't until 1990, almost 50 years later, that the Soviet Union officially admitted guilt. They released some documents. Not all. To this day, some files remain sealed. The psychological impact on Poland was catastrophic. A nation not only mourned, it was forced to pretend the wounds didn't exist. And even after the confession, Russian officials have occasionally cast doubt on the scale, or suggested shared responsibility. But the bullets told the truth. Ballistics proved the weapons were Soviet. The execution method was NKVD standard. The graves were mapped in Soviet files long before the Nazis arrived. Stalin didn't just silence a generation. He buried a country's identity and tried to rewrite it. Dekulakization, the war against the poor. You owned a few cows, a modest plot of land, maybe even hired one farmhand to help. That was enough to be labeled an enemy of the people. To Stalin, the concept of the kulak was more than just a class label. It was a target. The word originally referred to wealthier peasants. But under Stalin, its meaning warped. It no longer mattered how much land you owned, only that you weren't entirely dependent on the state. That independence, Stalin saw it as rebellion. In 1929, He declared war on his own farmers. The goal was liquidation of the kulaks as a class. His words, chilling in their clinical precision. What followed was one of the most brutal, systematic campaigns of internal repression in Soviet history. Nearly 2 million people were arrested. Hundreds of thousands were executed. Others were shipped to labor camps, or worse, dumped in frozen wastelands with no shelter, no tools, and no food. Families were given just minutes to pack. Some were dragged from their homes barefoot in winter. Children sobbed as parents were torn away. Entire villages emptied overnight. One Soviet schoolteacher remembered a girl in her class whispering, "They took Papa. They said he was a kulak. But all he did was help our neighbor fix her roof." She never returned to school. In some areas, local quotas were set for arrests. That meant even if there were no kulaks, local officials had to find them or invent them. Some were arrested simply for owning a sewing machine or having a larger-than-average home. One NKVD memo read, "If no kulaks can be found, select families arbitrarily to maintain discipline and fear." Some party members were horrified. One regional secretary tried to protest. Stalin had him removed and later executed. Perhaps the most perverse part? Many of the deportees weren't even accused of specific crimes. They were enemies by condition. By existing outside state dependence, they had to be destroyed. Survivor Lev Koplev described seeing a neighbor, a quiet, elderly woman, forced onto a train car with nothing but her coat and a loaf of bread. She looked like she was going to a funeral. Her own. And she was. He later said the worst part wasn't her expression. It was the silence. No one dared speak out. Fear choked every village like smoke. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had succeeded. He didn't just eliminate the kulaks. He obliterated the very idea that an individual could thrive without state control. What remained was a shattered peasantry, dependent on collective farms, terrified of stepping out of line. To make everyone equal, he made everyone afraid. The gulags, Stalin's cold hell. They weren't prisons. They were invisible graveyards, scattered across a continent, hidden in the snow. The word gulag stands for Glavno Upravlenie Lagerai, main camp administration. But behind the cold bureaucratic term lay one of the most terrifying realities of the 20th century. From 1930 to the 1950s, more than 18 million people passed through the Gulag system. That's not a typo. 18 million. Writers, engineers, priests, war heroes, peasants, children, anyone, for any reason or no reason at all. Some were arrested for telling jokes about Stalin, others for owning foreign books. One man received 10 years for possessing a photograph of Trotsky. A woman was imprisoned for keeping a letter from her husband, a soldier who had been executed without her knowledge. The Gulag was not just a punishment. It was a warning. You exist because the state allows you to. And the moment it changes its mind, you vanish. Conditions were beyond brutal. Camps stretched from the forests of Komi to the tundra of Kolyma, where temperatures could drop to -60 degrees Celsius. Prisoners worked 14 hours a day mining gold, felling trees, building roads through frozen earth. They slept in wooden barracks with no insulation. Rats and lice were constant companions. Food was barely enough to survive: watery soup, moldy bread, sometimes a handful of fish heads. One prisoner described the meals as enough to keep you alive, but not enough to keep you sane. Survivors spoke of cannibalism. Not rumors, reports. In some of the more remote camps, prisoners resorted to hunting weaker inmates just to survive. One Soviet doctor stationed at a camp near Magadan kept a secret notebook. Today, they found a man with his legs butchered. He was still alive. He never recovered from what he saw. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a former artillery officer, was imprisoned for criticizing Stalin in a private letter. He would later write the Gulag Archipelago, documenting the vast, interconnected system of terror. The line dividing good and evil, he wrote, cuts through the heart of every human being. He spent 8 years in the camps. In one passage, he recalls seeing a fellow inmate crawl out of the barracks, kneel in the snow, and eat handfuls of dirt. He wasn't insane, just hungry. There was no trial. Or if there was, it lasted minutes. You were told, 10 years without right of correspondence. That phrase meant more than exile. It meant your family wouldn't even know if you were alive. But perhaps the most chilling part? The camps didn't stop with Stalin's death. They slowed. But they didn't disappear overnight. And for decades, the full scale of the Gulag was hidden. Official Soviet history referred to it only as correctional labor. But there was no correction. Only suffering. In Stalin's USSR, even hope was contraband. The aviator's affair, when even victory couldn't protect you. In Stalin's world, loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was used against you. The year was 1946. World War II was over. The Soviet Union had emerged bloodied but triumphant. Victory parades thundered through Moscow. Red banners soared. But in the shadows of that glory, Stalin was growing suspicious again. This time, his target wasn't enemies. It was his own war heroes, specifically the Soviet Air Force. Stalin had expected Soviet aircraft to dominate the skies during the war. And while they had held their own, they had not matched the technological prowess of German and American planes. Someone had to be blamed. So Stalin ordered the arrest of dozens of top aviation engineers, test pilots, and military commanders. Not because they had failed, but because their competence, their independence, and their popularity made them dangerous. The brighter the spotlight on you, the closer Stalin pulled the trigger. It began with the secret arrest of Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, one of the most decorated air strategists of the war. He had designed bombing campaigns that crippled German supply lines and helped win the Battle of Berlin. But Stalin didn't trust him. Novikov was accused of sabotaging aircraft development and plotting against the state. Under brutal torture, he confessed to crimes he never committed. His interrogator, Lavrentiy Beria, the same man who had orchestrated the Great Purge. Novikov later said, "They beat me until I said what they wanted. Not what was true, what was convenient." He spent years in solitary confinement before being released quietly, without apology. But he was just one of many. Dozens of engineers who had developed cutting-edge aircraft were sent to Sharashkas, secret prison laboratories where they were forced to design Soviet technology under surveillance. If they succeeded, Stalin took the credit. If they failed, they vanished. One such engineer, Valentin Glushko, was imprisoned in a Sharashka where he helped develop the Soviet rocket engine system, while sharing a cell with men who had been sentenced to death. He later wrote, "We created with our minds while our bodies rotted." The aviator's affair spread fear throughout the scientific community. Innovation stalled, not from lack of talent, but from terror. After all, who dared to invent something great, if it meant being seen? Stalin's paranoia infected everything, not just politics, but progress. He didn't just control the past. He was trying to control the future. And that future, under his rule, belonged to no one but him. In Stalin's USSR, your greatest achievement could become your final mistake. Legacy of terror, the ghost that still walks. Stalin died in 1953, but he never truly left. When Joseph Stalin collapsed in his dacha outside Moscow, he lay on the floor for over 12 hours before help was called. His guards were too afraid to enter without orders. His ministers hesitated, unsure whether it was a trap or another one of Stalin's tests. By the time a doctor arrived, it was too late. A brain hemorrhage had paralyzed him. He died slowly, gasping for breath. And yet, for millions, his death came too late. Officially, Stalin was mourned. The streets of Moscow flooded with weeping citizens. Statues were draped in black cloth. Songs were sung. But in private homes, far from the eyes of the KGB, there was silence. And sometimes, relief. In one Siberian town, survivors of the Gulag lit a candle, not to honor Stalin, but to mourn those he had taken. They placed it in a broken cup and whispered the names of their fathers, brothers, wives. Names they hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. The truth about Stalin's reign was slow to surface. His successors, especially Khrushchev, denounced his cult of personality. The 1956 secret speech acknowledged some of the purges, some of the lies. But even then, only partially. Only what was politically convenient. Entire archives remained sealed. Others were destroyed. Historians estimate between 15 and 20 million people died as a direct result of Stalin's purges, famines, deportations, and camps. Some place the number higher. But the exact toll? We may never know. Because the Soviet machine didn't just erase lives. It erased proof they ever existed. To this day, Stalin's legacy remains deeply divided. In Russia, polls still show a significant portion of the population views him as a strong leader. Statues of him are still restored. Streets still bear his name. But across Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, and much of the former USSR, his name brings only pain. In 2019, a mass grave was unearthed near Vladivostok. Over 5,000 skeletons, hands tied, bullets in skulls. Nearby, they found scraps of cloth with names sewn into them. Names long forgotten. Prisoners who were never registered. Men who had simply vanished. One piece of fabric had a message stitched inside the hem. "I am not guilty. Tell my wife I love her." But no one told her. Until now. Stalin's terror didn't just shatter the present. It poisoned memory. It forced generations to rewrite their own histories. Children grew up believing their parents were traitors. Wives lived their lives as widows without graves. And even now, the silence lingers. Because the deepest scars aren't on the skin. They're in the stories we never told. But something is changing. Each year, more documents are declassified. More graves uncovered. More survivors, or their children, come forward. In Kiev, in Warsaw, in Siberian villages, memory is becoming resistance. Every name remembered is one more stolen light restored. He didn't just erase people. He erased truth. He replaced it with silence and fear. But truth has a way of surviving. Through the words of survivors. Through buried bones. Through forbidden books passed from hand to hand. And through stories like this. Because remembering isn't just mourning. It's justice. If this moved you, if you believe history must not be forgotten, this is the channel where hidden stories live again. Hit subscribe. Comment below. What other stories must be remembered? Share this, because silence let it happen the first time. And it must never happen again.